My name is Ethan. I'm 46 years old, and 3 years ago I made the mistake that, according to my wife, ruined our lives, but that, in reality, marked the beginning of my freedom. The day I signed over our family home in exchange for the keys to a bankrupt textile factory, she didn't scream. She simply looked at me with a kind of contempt that burned more than any insult and said, "You're a pathological failure, Ethan, and I'm not going down with you." She threw her wedding ring at my face, while the suitcases were already lined up by the door. She didn't want a man with vision, she wanted a reliable ATM. And when the balance hit zero, her love vanished. Watching her walk away with the man who ran the legal department of my own competitor was the final blow, the public humiliation that was supposed to destroy me. But she made a fatal miscalculation. She thought she had taken everything from me, without realizing that a man who isn't afraid of losing anything is the most dangerous man in the world. While she was celebrating her new life built on other people's money, I was sleeping on a couch in a cold office, planning the move that would leave her on her knees, begging for a fraction of what she once despised. If you enjoy stories where betrayal has consequences and justice arrives without warning, hit like and subscribe. Here we share real stories of revenge and lessons that are never forgotten. For 15 years, I was the architect of a stability that slowly turned into my own cage. I woke up at 5 every morning, worked 12-hour days at a financial consulting firm, and came home to a house that smelled of expensive furniture polish and deafening silence. Melissa, my wife, was the image of social perfection, always flawless, always attentive to what the neighbors thought, always demanding more. Our house wasn't a home, it was a trophy. 4 bedrooms, a Japanese garden, and a mortgage that drained my soul every single month. I was good at my job, very good. I had a trained eye for spotting value where others saw nothing but junk. But inside my own marriage, I was blind. She loved the lifestyle my paycheck provided, not the man wearing himself down to sustain it. Over time, I noticed the spark in her eyes only appeared when we bought a new car or booked vacations at exclusive resorts. When I mentioned exhaustion or the idea of building something of my own, her face hardened into cold indifference. To her, my only role was to be the provider of unbreakable security. At 43, something inside me shifted. I was tired of advising mediocre men on how to build fortunes while I remained chained to a desk. That's when the textile plant opportunity appeared. It was a disaster. Outdated machinery, debts to suppliers, and a union on the verge of exploding. But it had something no one else saw. A smart fabric patent buried in a drawer and a strategically perfect logistics location. The original owner was desperate to retire and accepted a deal everyone else called insane. I didn't have enough cash, so I put up the only thing of real value I owned, the deed to our house. I remember the night I tried to explain it to Melissa. We were sitting in the dining room surrounded by designer furniture that suddenly felt absurd. I told her this was our chance to be truly wealthy, to stop depending on anyone. She didn't even finish her glass of wine. She looked at me with a mix of disgust and pity. She didn't ask about the business model or the patent. Her only concern was where she would store her designer clothes if we lost the house. That week, the atmosphere at home turned toxic. She stopped speaking to me, communicating only through slammed doors and heavy sighs. I spent my nights in the study, analyzing balance sheets and restructuring plans, while I heard her whispering on the phone, probably to her mother or her friends, complaining about her husband's delusions of grandeur. I felt pressure in my chest, but it wasn't fear, it was absolute clarity. I knew the risk was total, but I'd rather die trying something meaningful than live a small life next to a woman who valued me only for my ability to pay. Melissa started going out more, coming home late, wearing perfumes I had never bought her. The distance was both physical and emotional. I realized she had disconnected from our story long before I signed the papers. She was preparing her exit, looking for a higher branch to jump to before my so-called ship sank. What she didn't understand was that comfort is the death of ambition. I was willing to sleep on the factory floor if it meant owning my destiny. She couldn't imagine a life without the status of our upscale neighborhood. Every time she saw me come home with grease on my hands or exhaustion on my face from negotiating with creditors, her contempt grew. She treated me like a stranger, like an inconvenience threatening her comfort. She began withdrawing money from our joint account, small amounts at first, then larger ones, preparing for the end. I saw it all on the statements, but I said nothing. My mind was on the factory, on the looms that needed repair, on the clients I had to win back. I was fighting a two-front war, one against the market and one against the woman who had sworn to stand by me for better or worse. The balance finally broke the day the bank sent confirmation of the property transfer. The die was cast. I was no longer the owner of a luxury home. I was the owner of a company in ruins. And to Melissa, that was the same as being socially dead. She wasn't going to stay and watch the funeral of my career. At least that's what she thought. What she never understood was this. I wasn't buying a bankrupt factory. I was buying my future, brick by brick, even if it meant standing alone in the dark. The day the moving trucks arrived at the house, they weren't there to pack our things, only hers. Melissa didn't even wait 24 hours after the property transfer became official. She moved through the hallways with ruthless efficiency, pointing out which furniture belonged to her and which pieces I could keep to burn as firewood in my junk factory. I stood by the living room window, watching her dismantle 15 years of marriage in barely 3 hours. I didn't say a word. No begging, no tears. Silence was my only armor. She stopped in front of me, wrapped in her fur coat, wearing a look of malicious triumph. I've hired a lawyer, Ethan. I'm not just leaving. I'm going to make sure you don't keep a single dollar from whatever you manage to salvage from that landfill you bought, she said, twirling the keys to a car I could no longer afford. What hurt wasn't the divorce. It was the revelation of her systematic betrayal. That same afternoon, while I was trying to organize the few documents I still had, I received an anonymous email. Photos, hotel receipts, records. Melissa hadn't just left me at my lowest point. She'd been cheating on me for the past 6 months with Julian, the legal director of my main competitor, the very man who had tried to sabotage my purchase of the textile plant. Everything clicked with surgical precision. She had been feeding him information about my financial moves, my weaknesses, my desperation. It wasn't enough to abandon me. She wanted to make sure the factory never took off, so I'd crawl back to her defeated, or better yet, disappear entirely. They laughed about me at elegant dinners while I was counting pennies to make payroll for my employees. The humiliation went public days later. In the social circles we used to move in, my name became a punchline. The idiot who traded a mansion for scrap metal, they said. Then came the court notice. Melissa was demanding spousal support based on my income from the past 10 years, deliberately ignoring the fact that I no longer had a salary. One afternoon, she showed up at the factory, unannounced, accompanied by Julian. His suit cost more than all the furniture in my office combined. They walked in without permission, scanning the peeling walls with condescending smiles. "We came to see how the Empire is doing, Ethan," Julian said, wrapping an arm around my wife's waist with a familiarity that turned my stomach. Melissa looked at my hands, stained with grease, because I had been repairing one of the machines myself, and let out a dry laugh. "Look at you, you're pathetic. Julian says this plant will shut down in 3 months because of an environmental lawsuit he's already drafting. You should have accepted the liquidation offer we sent you." Something inside me died in that moment. The rage didn't explode, it froze. I stared at them, noticing how she avoided direct eye contact, hiding behind her lover's shoulder. Julian pulled an envelope from his jacket and dropped it onto my grease-covered desk. "It's an offer to buy the land," he said. "It's nothing, but it's enough to pay your debts and move into a 1-bedroom apartment. Melissa wants to wrap this up quickly." She nodded, adjusting her sunglasses. "Do it for your own good, Ethan. You don't have the talent for this. You're just an employee who thinks he's a boss." They walked out, leaving behind a trail of expensive perfume that reeked of betrayal. I stood there alone, staring at the envelope. That night, the plant was dark, no heat. The cold cut straight to the bone. I sat on the concrete floor, my back against the machine I'd just repaired. I had lost my house, my status, my wife, and my reputation. Friends had stopped returning my calls. My family looked at me with pity. I had reached the lowest point a man can reach, absolute ridicule. But as my hand rested on the cold metal, I felt a vibration. It wasn't the machine. It was my own resolve. They thought they had cornered me, but what they had really done was remove my chains. I no longer had to pretend to be the perfect husband for an empty woman or the obedient consultant for a soulless firm. I was free. That night, surrounded by the smell of oil and dust, I made a silent vow. I wouldn't quit, I wouldn't disappear, and I wouldn't forgive. I would use every ounce of my intelligence to turn that scrap heap into a weapon. Melissa wanted to see a social corpse. But what she would get was a lesson she wouldn't forget, not even with all of her lover's money. Being expelled from my own home was the sacrifice required to step into my own kingdom. The rebuilding didn't begin with money. It began with discipline. For the next 18 months, my life was reduced to 4 walls inside the factory. I slept on a narrow cot beside the boiler, my only companion the constant hum of the machines. While Melissa enjoyed beach trips with Julian, I focused on digging up the treasure they had overlooked in their arrogance. The smart fabric patent wasn't just paperwork. It was the future of tactical and medical apparel. But to unlock it, I needed silence and precision. I didn't look for traditional bank loans. I knew Julian had contacts in every major bank and would block any attempt. Instead, I turned to an old ally, Matthew, a 70-year-old engineer who had been fired from a major consulting firm for being too old, and who knew the secrets of textile machinery better than anyone alive. Matthew and I formed a blood pact. He brought the technical knowledge, and I brought the financial strategy. We operated under the radar, functioning like a ghost company to avoid attention. I knew that if Melissa or Julian noticed any movement, they would send inspection after inspection to suffocate me. My revenge wasn't going to be a frontal attack. It was going to be an infiltration. Through intermediaries and shell companies, I began quietly buying up the debts of Julian's own firm. That's when I discovered the truth. To sustain the lifestyle Melissa demanded, Julian had been misappropriating client funds and taking reckless risks. She was a luxury parasite, consuming resources at a pace not even a high-level executive could maintain. I simply waited for gravity to do its work, while my factory began producing smart fabric for a government contract we had secured in complete secrecy. My lawyer, a ruthless man named Vargas, handled the rest. Vargas specialized in high-conflict divorces and financial fraud. I handed him every piece of evidence of Melissa's infidelity and her collusion with Julian to sabotage my company. "Patience, Ethan," Vargas would say as he reviewed the files. "Revenge is a dish best served cold, but in this case we're going to serve it frozen." We decided not to present anything during the initial divorce proceedings. We let her believe she was winning. We let her see me as a finished man with nothing left to offer. I allowed the judge to issue a minimal ruling in my favor, letting her walk away with a portion of my so-called losses. She laughed in the courthouse hallways, arm in arm with her lover, calling me the loom beggar. What she didn't know was that every dollar she spent on luxury dinners was, technically, a debt I was acquiring through my holding companies. The turning point came when we developed the ultralight carbon fiber. It was a silent revolution. While the textile world remained stagnant, we held the monopoly on a material the aerospace industry desperately needed. I didn't announce it. I waited until Julian's company was at its most vulnerable, right before its annual audit. I knew he was relying on a specific contract to save himself. From the shadows, I took it from him at the last second, offering a superior technology he didn't even know existed. The counterattack was pure mathematics. There was no hatred in my moves, only logic. I analyzed Melissa's habits, her credit card spending, her travel patterns, her addiction to social validation. She was building her castle on the sand of Julian's fortune, and I was digging the hole beneath them both. My transformation was physical as well. I lost weight. My eyes hardened into steel. The hesitant man she left in that mansion died, replaced by someone who no longer understood mercy. One day, I received a call from an old colleague. "Is it true, Ethan? Is it true that you're behind the firm that just bought the majority of the competition's debt?" I didn't answer. I hung up and looked out the window of my office, now modern, clean, and fully rebuilt. The stage was set. The pieces were in place. Melissa and Julian were celebrating a false victory, unaware that the man they had spit on now owned their debts, their secrets, and, very soon, their complete downfall. Patience is the virtue of kings. And I had become the ruler of an empire they helped build with their contempt. The climax didn't happen in a dark office, but under the bright lights of an industry gala, the place where Melissa and Julian felt most powerful. I showed up without warning, not as the man with grease-stained hands, but as the majority partner of the group that had just absorbed Julian's firm. When I stepped into the ballroom, silence spread like an oil slick. I saw them at the main table laughing, convinced they owned the world. When Julian spotted me, his expression shifted from confusion to a nervous laugh. He stood up, straightened his jacket, trying to hold the facade. "Ethan, what are you doing here? This isn't a place for factory workers," he said loudly, fishing for approval from the crowd. Melissa didn't even look at me at first. She was too busy checking her reflection in a champagne glass, but when she finally did, her face went pale. I walked toward them with a calm that terrified them more than any shout ever could. I didn't offer a handshake. I simply placed a black leather folder on the table, right on top of their expensive dinner plates. "Julian, I brought you a farewell gift," I said, my voice low and steady. He opened the folder, and as he flipped through the pages, the color drained from his lips. Inside were the enforcement orders on his personal debts and a detailed report of the embezzlement he had committed to finance Melissa's indulgences. But the most important document was the ownership notice. My company now owned his lease, his offices, and his bank accounts. In less than 10 minutes, that man would be escorted out of his own building by security. Melissa stood up, trying to fall back on her old manipulation. "Ethan, this is ridiculous. You can't do this to us. We have rights. This is all just spite because I left you." Her voice trembled, but that trace of arrogance that always irritated me was still there. I looked her straight in the eyes, completely cold. "This isn't spite, Melissa. It's business. You told me I had no talent, that I was a failure. Well, the failure just bought your life." At that moment, 2 court officers entered the ballroom. Julian tried to protest, but the evidence of fraud was so overwhelming that not even his own lawyers, present at the gala, dared to step in. The scandal was absolute. The whispers of the elite who once mocked me now focused on the spectacular collapse of their golden couple. The irony was the final blow. As the officers led Julian away for questioning about the missing funds, I approached Melissa, now standing alone in the middle of the room, her makeup smeared, her eyes empty. I reminded her of the night she threw her wedding ring in my face. "You asked me what I'd do without the house. Well, now you're the one with nowhere to go. Julian has lost every last dollar, and since your name is tied to his in every fraudulent expense, the creditors will come for your jewelry and designer bags before the week is over." She tried to say something, maybe an apology, maybe a plea, but I placed a hand on her shoulder, gently, just enough for her to feel my control. "Don't thank me for the lesson, Melissa. Consider it payment for the 15 years I wasted believing you were a partner." I left the ballroom without looking back as camera flashes captured her humiliation. I didn't feel explosive joy, only a deep, icy peace. I had reclaimed my honor not just by making money, but by proving that intelligence and patience always defeat cheap betrayal. My factory was no longer a pile of scrap. It was the engine of a fortune she would never touch. That night, as I returned to my office, the news broke. Julian's firm had filed for technical bankruptcy. The man she chose for his security turned out to be a house of cards, and I was the one who blew it over. Justice wasn't poetic. It was financial, and it was legal. They fell not because I was cruel, but because they were too arrogant to realize that the man they trampled was the only one who knew how to build something real from ashes. Today, 3 years after that night at the gala, the world looks at me differently. I'm the owner of a technology holding company that dominates the advanced materials market, but my greatest wealth isn't in bank accounts. It's in the silence of my conscience. Julian ended up facing charges for fraud and embezzlement. He lost his license, his properties, and his dignity. Melissa, on the other hand, tried to reach out to me months later. She sent emails filled with fake nostalgia, talking about mistakes from the past and how stress had clouded her judgment. I didn't reply with a single word. The last I heard, she was living in a small rented apartment, working at a second-hand clothing store. far removed from the luxury and exclusivity she once demanded. The man she dismissed as a failure is now the one supporting the livelihoods of hundreds of families, while she has become nothing more than a blurred memory in my story. I've learned that success is the most elegant form of justice. I didn't need to shout, fight, or lower myself to their level. I only needed to wait, work, and let their own greed consume them. The house she loved so much was demolished to make room for an office complex. Nothing we shared still stands. Sometimes, as I walk through the halls of my factory, now modern and immaculate, I stop in front of the old boiler where I once slept when I had nothing. It reminds me of who I am and what I'm capable of. Melissa's betrayal was, ironically, the best deal of my life. It forced me to stop being a spectator in my own existence and become the protagonist of my destiny. I don't feel hatred. Hatred requires energy. I'd rather invest in my companies. What I feel is absolute indifference. Watching them collapse didn't bring me pleasure because of their pain, but because it confirmed something simple. A man's character is his destiny. She chose the easy path, the surface-level shine and betrayal. I chose the hard road, effort and loyalty to my own vision. The result is plain for everyone to see. Sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's watching life collect its debts. If this story felt as intense to you as it was for me to live it, hit like and tell me in the comments what you would have done. And if you're not subscribed yet, turn on notifications so you don't miss the next stories.